Welcome. I'm James Calicut, Waterfowl and Upland Gamebird Extension Specialist.
I'm Mark McConnell, Assistant Professor of Upland Birds at Mississippi State University.
Dr. Brian Davis, Professor, Waterfowl and Wetlands Conservation.
The three of us are all biologists and hunters. Join us for discussions about game bird conservation and management and the science behind it. Of course, we'll also have conversations about bird dogs and bird hunting as well. This is Gamebird University. We are have our guest in person this week because Dr. Dwayne Elmore came to participate in our seminar series. We appreciate him coming and talking about his work. And Dwayne, you are the director of the Gamebird Program at Tall Timbers.
That's correct. Yep. I've been there about a year and a half and love that part of the world and glad to be working for a private organization. I've spent the last 17 years in university with an extension research appointment, but pretty much my whole career I've been in the game bird world.
Fantastic. Well, I know we all really enjoyed your seminar yesterday, and that's kind of what a lot of our seminars we've had have been, folks that are doing applied research. It's going to translate into boots on the ground management. And so no surprise, a lot of our folks were extension specialists like you had been, because a lot of that our stakeholders want to know is that sort of thing. Like what does that research tell us about how to improve things for quail or turkeys or ducks or what have you? So, but yours is super interesting because you focus most of your seminar on thermal ecology. And so like how, that thermal conditions and such influence different aspects of bird behavior, whether their habitat selection or, some of their nesting activity. And I just thought that was super cool and something that not a lot about that in the Southeast. And we don't talk about that all that much. And so I thought that was really cool and thought that'd be something fun for us to talk about is all some of the things you talked about in your seminar and maybe some of how, if we're going to do some of that stuff in the Southeast, what that might look like, since most of your work was out a little further west of the typical bobwhite range.
Temperature is interesting because if you look at the first chapter of any biology book, listed as like one of the fundamental things that affects animals, their growth, their physiology, reproduction. And then when you get in ecology, we kind of stop talking about it. And we know it. I mean, in the background, we always know that it's important, that temperature affects things, the weather affects, reproduction of game birds, but there's very little actual data that a manager could apply to, well, what does that look like? And is there anything you can do about it? Or is it just, this fixed thing that's happening in the background? So to me, that was kind of fascinating that we know temperature is really important to organisms, but we really don't have much data, especially anything that's applicable from a management standpoint, at least in the bird and mammal world. Now, if you get into, animals that use the environment more directly to regulate their temperature, like reptiles, that's different. There's tons of research in the reptile world and amphibians, but not so much with birds, particularly birds that we hunt.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the coolest things that you were talking about yesterday that I think that people that hunt quail or upland birds in general or people that just want to management also is, like you said, when you think about temperature, it's often, okay, how's the temperature outside affect them? How does climate change affect them? How does major storm events or winter or summer heat? But what you did, overly simplifying the body of work you presented yesterday, but it was a lot of really kind of micro look at kind of how this, still the coolest thing you talked about, I thought, that was most eye-opening to me the first time you explained it to me. The difference is how much variability there is in temperature on the landscape where the quail are at, right? So the ambient temperature and then what do you call it, the operative temperature. That stuff was fascinating.
Operative is kind of a fancy way of saying kind of like the real field temperature. Yeah. Ambient is basically if you go on a weather station right now and look up what's the temperature starting with Mississippi, you're basically seeing ambient. Yeah. That is the shaded temperature, without the direct influence of solar radiation and wind and, all these influences around it from vegetation that might also affect that temperature. And that's the remarkable thing is that, and that's really where you have to start. If you're trying to understand how, let's say, quail might be influenced by temperatures, first you have to know what does the temperature even look like across space and time. And so on a lot of these projects, we spent a lot of effort putting sensors, moving them around at different times of the day in different places, as you said, at different scales, trying to understand, well, how does that shrub look different than this patch of grass versus this open space versus under the canopy of this pine tree? If you just plot that data, it kind of blows you away. It's like, there are a lot of options. Surely organisms are cognizant of that.
Yeah.
I mean, we are, right?
Yeah.
If we have a field day and it's a hot sunny day, we all move to
shade.
When we maybe will gravitate to a hill where we're catching a little breeze.
Yeah.
So it's like, why do we think quail, turkeys don't make behavioral decisions?
Way more
like
important
that?
for them than us.
Yeah.
It's not directly probably impacting our ability to thermoregulate as much as it is theirs.
Exactly. I thought that was. I think maybe I'm off here on how much of a difference that was, but on when you plotted kind of like all that range of temperatures over, time and space, like in any given day at any given temperature, like there could be as much as as far as from the ambient temperature or whatever, just like 40 degrees difference.
Yeah. Same ambient. So
At the
let's
same
say
ambient,
it's
yeah.
a 95-degree ambient temperature outside. The operative could be lower, maybe as low as 85, all the way up to 130.
Wow.
So it's a huge, that's Fahrenheit.
Yeah.
So that's a huge range. And some of those temperatures would be lethal. Quail, especially
For
chicks
quail,
or
yeah.
poults, they would not be able to survive more than a couple of minutes at some of those temperatures.
Well, that's the other thing so we were doing some of this with Jeff Graham's work at Itchaway, and I only started thinking about this stuff since you were telling me about it several years ago. We were hunting together. So, Guthrie, I don't know if Guthrie was the first one to do it, but the first paper I remember talking about the kind of the thermal threshold, like the thermal tolerance, like what is it, about 85 point something degrees above Fahrenheit, a bobwhite enters thermal stress.
Yeah.
Right. So that's one thing I don't think most people know, that the threshold for thermal stress, that doesn't mean they die, but it means they're in thermal stress and they have to either do a flutter or move.
Start behaving.
They have to start changing they have to change something to regulate temperature. I don't think most people know that, right? That it's that low. I think a lot of people would assume it's higher.
Yeah, I mean, that's a comment I've gotten a lot, because as you said, a lot of this research that, I've done up until this point has been Oklahoma, New Mexico, Texas, Kansas, and everybody knows it gets really hot there.
Yeah.
Well, it gets really hot here too. In fact, if the threshold of thermal stress is 85 degrees Fahrenheit, most of the distribution of northern bobwhite is within that, a big portion of the year. I mean, where I'm working now, it could be 85 degrees in January.
That's right.
And it often is. So a big chunk of the year, and certainly a big portion of the day, they could be under some type of stress. And as you said, that doesn't mean they're going to die, but it does mean they have to make some decisions, which can help us from a management standpoint. Like, do they have that option? Or are we creating conditions on the landscape that give them that option?
Well, I was thinking of three things that, like from your talk the other day, that most people in the bobwhite world, outside of like quail researchers, surely hopefully quail researchers are aware of this, but if you're just a quail enthusiast, a quail manager or something like that, you might not know this. So the one thing, just to back up a step, that you, I think, have done a better job than most people of saying is you're one of the few people that will say quail are a shrub obligate. There's a lot of people still saying they're grassland obligate, which really they're not. And so the importance of shrub cover for quail is probably, in the deep south especially, in my opinion, the most underappreciated aspect, or under talked about and under management focus about. So that's one. Most people I don't think would know, like we said, the at what point they become thermal stress. And then the other kind of real cool take home from what your stuff yesterday you showed was not all shrub cover is created equal from a thermal standpoint.
Absolutely.
Right? Because we know structurally we think some stuff's better than others. But I can remember when you and I were hunting in Oklahoma, and you told me that about the different shrubs and the different temperatures. I was like, oh my goodness. So then I started thinking, well, in the South, I have no clue the range of temperature, operative temperature differentials between.
Nobody does.
Nobody does.
It's totally unstudied.
Walk the listeners through kind of just what the cool part about the temperature differences by cover.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm glad you said, the shrub obligate, because that's really important, grossly underappreciated. And I'd say you could apply that to all North American quail. I mean, arguably the only one that might be a stretch to say it's a shrub obligate is marns.
Yeah.
But really all the others, and often, we see this strong, if you look at resource space use selection, even across the year, you see strong selection for some type of woody cover.
Right.
And it varies depending on where you're at in the world. We'll just think about bobwhites for a minute. In the Llano Estacado, as far west as they occur, it might be shinnery oak, which is a little low-growing oak. And on the coastal dunes, of Cape Cod, there's some runner oak there. Yep. Or, in between, it might be brambles or sweet gum sprouts. There is a lot of different options. And I naively used to tell managers, you just need shrub cover. You need shrubs well dispersed across the landscape so that quail can use it for loafing and escape. And I should have recognized, well, why are they loafing? It's not just loafing to keep from getting eaten. It's loafing to keep from overheating.
That's right.
And so when you think about the mechanisms that are driving that selection, that's where I think we glossed over a lot of the temperature. And when we started measuring temperature under these specific shrub species at different times of the day, we saw that they're what's driving a lot of that variability we were talking about at a given ambient. I'll take a couple that I'm real familiar with. Sagebrush, which is an artemisia that occurs a lot it's common in the Great Plains. It's pretty good cover in the wintertime. Like, you'll find quail using it. In the summertime, it's a death trap. It can be 20 or 30 degrees hotter than the ambient.
Oh, wow.
And so on a 100-degree day, it can be pushing 140. And even an adult quail can't survive that for very long.
Doesn't like 106 or some temperature?
Protein starts to denature.
Protein starts to denature or something? Yeah.
Yep. So
Jeez.
that's not a good place to be especially if you're a little small bobwhite that, relies on an adult to do most of your temperature regulation for you. Now, the same temperature at the same time within a softball throw of that sand sagebrush, you can have an aromatic sumac, which is a rust species. That one doesn't occur in the southeast, but it's similar structurally to a lot of the sumacs that do occur here, although it's a little bit denser. But that plant is often 5 or maybe even 10 degrees cooler than ambient. Wow. So it can be remarkably cooler. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Well, why is that? I mean, we think of it kind of simplistically. It must be shade. That doesn't entirely explain it, because you can have two shrubs that both have almost 100% shade cover, and yet they will still differ by a large degree in the temperature.
Reflectance off the leaf or something?
There's a lot of different mechanisms that could be going on, and we haven't really dove into that yet from a game management standpoint. It could be reflectance absorption differences. It could be different evapotranspiration rates between the plants. Some close their stomates more than others. It could be the architecture of the plant allows more airflow. So you've got, convective cooling. You can have more conductive heat transfer from plants that are absorbing heat and then radiating it out. It could be differences in soil moisture. Some plants might be pulling more moisture up from deep, and there could be different levels of humidity. So there is a lot of different mechanisms that could be operating that's driven by that plant. So from a manager standpoint, you automatically should be thinking, well, if that's true, I actually have some control over this. I can't make it cooler ambient, but I can influence the operative temperature, and maybe more than you realize.
So figuring out which shrubs are providing that best environment, as much of them as you can fit, and then maybe just having some diversity of shrub cover. Because like you said, the one shrub, I can't remember the name of, was better in the winter.
Yeah, it's Chickasaw plum.
And then one was too hot in the summer, but it was okay cover in the winter. So make sure you're covering both periods of thermal risk, I guess, perhaps, is a simple way to think of it. And Chickasaw plums were the best
in the winter.
Yeah.
And actually, in our study, that was the only shrub species that was always selected more than available at all times of the year. But it really appeared to be important during those cold periods where most of the coveys went to the Chickasaw plum, but they selected for it year round. So that's a really good one to have. We don't know, like, as you said, Mark, we don't know on some of these shrubs in the southeast what their thermal signatures look like, because nobody's really measured that yet. But based on what we have seen in other places, in the absence of information, it's a good hedge, as you said, to just have some diversity of cover types.
I can tell you just on I'm thinking back to the first telemetry project I did on the weight track when I was an intern at Tall Timbers, 2007. That was a really dry year. It was a drought. So it wasn't like a banner production year by any means. The vegetation was really short, because I can remember trapping rats on a rat grid in 07. Then when I came back from my PhD, the same grid, and I can remember the vegetation in 07, and then it was knee high, and then 5 years later it was really high. But I can remember during the day when I would go out altering which birds I tracked at times a day. I can remember on the weight track there was these little ag fields, and he had at the time they were pine tree strip kind of stuff, not ideal shrub cover, but they were young pine trees. They were densely planted. They were essentially operating as somewhat shrubby cover at that time. And I can remember at certain times of the day, it was almost a guarantee those birds were going to be in that thicker stuff where it was super shady and the blackberries had come up. Yeah. And it wasn't more than a 30, 40 foot strip. It wasn't too narrow, probably ideally, but it was the only thing that was there. because everything else was just wiregrass. Kind of, you've been out there.
Yeah.
There's not just a whole lot of shrub cover
there's
on,
not.
on the weight track. Then you fast forward to the last telemetry project I did in Mississippi. One of my students carried out, same thing. Heat of the day, there wasn't a lot of shrub cover out there, and it was mostly, unfortunately, it was a lot of sawtooth oak thickets because they had planted a lot of sawtooth, and we had come in a few years before that and hinge cut them, and it was just blackberry real thick, and they were just stuck to it and like crazy. But we noticed there wasn't a whole lot on that farm, so we took that and we said, okay, let's spend the next few years just planting Chickasaw plum thickets. And we've planted, I think, over 5,000-6,000 in the last few years out there. But now we're just waiting for them to get to a point where they can actually provide that. But it got me thinking about properties in the Southeast. Blackberry, dogwood thickets, those things occur. And sometimes plum thickets occur naturally in some areas. And like you said, sometimes young sweet gum, which we're often fighting in the piney woods, is the only woody cover there is. So like the whole idea of just shrub research and alone, and then temperature research within that, in the Deep South, we just don't have anything.
And I think it is. I mean, a manager asked me one time, it's like, well, why does it matter? Because we know shrubs are important from a screening standpoint.
Sure.
We already recognize that. Like, does it really matter that we understand the temperature? I think it does, because if you start understanding the mechanisms, you have more predictive power.
Sure.
To be able to say, under these conditions, we think this vegetation type or this structure is more important. Do you have that on your landscape? And so if we just know that shrubs are important alone, we go into it very naively, and we can miss something. And sometimes these very discrete events, like this 48-hour period where it was 10 degrees, that might really change the trajectory of that population for that year.
Yeah.
That one single event. And if you could have had a slightly different cover type, and instead of having 30% mortality, only had 10% mortality, that can really affect fall standing crop the next year. So I say it does matter.
I agree.
And we need to think about this multifaceted and know that birds are making decisions at different times for different reasons. Yes, screening cover from predation is really important. Everything's trying to kill the need quail, but thermal cover is also important. And we can circle back to this, but olfactory cover is also something that's understudied. How these vegetation types influence airflow and the ability for scent-based mammals, primarily, their ability to find and detect prey. And so when you think about it like that, you realize that vegetation type that I don't see quail using very often, but they use it 4 or 5 days a year under these extreme conditions, it can make a huge difference, because we've seen in a 48-hour period under extreme weather, 15% or 20% of the population die.
Yeah.
That happens sometimes.
Well, before we go to olfactory, because that was a perfect segue there, but somebody brought up, or maybe you brought up in your seminar, the snowstorm we had, and I can't remember when it was. Was it February, March?
Yeah, I think it was in February this year.
Because we had it here, but I didn't have any birds on air in Mississippi. But y'all got tons of birds always on air, tall timbers and various properties out there, and then our birds at Itchaway. So of course we got the email that they were shutting down, telling people not to come in. And I was like, oh my God, no, we've got to go out and check these birds, because what an opportunity. Like I said, probably the 100 years since we've had 5-6 inches of snow in South Georgia. So I'm texting everybody like, no, look, we've got like, and the student, he's from Minnesota. He knows how to drive in the snow. And let's be honest, it's not Minnesota snow. It's South Georgia snow.
4 inches.
On a sandy road. It's be fine. Like, no one's going off the edge here. So I'm calling Mike and I'm like, oh God, please let him go out and check. And the student's like, well, should I? And I didn't want to like violate Itchaway protocol, which I of course would not. But it was almost like I was this close to like, just don't tell anybody, just go track the birds, because I wanted to know where they were. And it was interesting. At first, they were holed up, but they were just holed up in shrubby cover. And then the next day, because it didn't really melt it was about 30, almost 2 days before it started to melt. They were in just the thick shrubby stuff, but some of it was the stuff that like it wasn't like ideal.
Exactly.
It was the stuff you're like, we're probably like, it was stuff David probably wanted to rip out of there eventually, because it was so hairy.
Yeah. I mean, we were on tall timbers. We tracked birds as soon as it was safe to do so. And I went out with a dog immediately because I wanted to know, where are they? And I'm looking at tracks, I'm looking at roost piles, and I was there the first morning after the storm, but late in the morning, most of them were still in their roost location. They'd not moved, and they were super jumpy. Their behavior was bizarre. I mean, it's like they didn't know
what is this,
and they were. But then immediately thereafter, as you said, they went into what we would normally say are suboptimal places. They were in these blowdowns, these big brush piles, things that we tell managers, you probably should clean that up because that's a predator attraction. And, there probably were predators in there at the same time, but the quail were telling us that they were covered efficient when the whole world was blanketed with snow.
Yeah.
And they went to those real thick places. Yeah, I mean, it kind of does make you scratch your heads like, should we leave some of that? Maybe we don't.
How often do we have that?
Yeah.
Down here, and this is the other thing I wanted to get at in our Avian Science Center, and you and I have talked about this, like in a controlled setting. What I really want to do one day is keep quail wet and cold in a controlled setting and see if I and then with, like I was telling you, with like optimal diet and then suboptimal as corollaries for good, high quality and low quality habitat. And then look at because we don't think the weather, that was a 100-year snow event, but we don't often think that the weather is all that important for quail in the deep south, but it can be. So we don't have several feet of snow that stays for weeks, but we got rain that lasts sometimes 3 or 4 days in a row.
Right.
And if you get a really, really, really wet, a lot of rain and poor cover, and then the temperature drops, quail aren't necessarily going to die from exposure, but I think it's perfectly reasonable to think that it could make them more vulnerable to predation. It could make them more
stop nesting.
It could make them more stressed out. And so I'd love to figure out a way to get at because with pen raised birds, you see this all the time. If it's really wet and they get cold, you'll just find them dead, right? Well, that doesn't typically happen with wild birds down here because they can tolerate it. But we've had rain that lasts for when a hurricane comes, in tall timbers. If you get just inundated with rain, I don't care the best shrub cover in the world, those birds are wet. And then if that temperature just drops a little bit, does it stress them out enough? Does it force them? Does it prevent them from being more, all these things we can do to them, and how does it affect them? But we've never looked at that because the thermal ecology question has historically been relegated to, other than some stuff like the 30s and 40s, it's been relegated to the western part of the range.
Yeah.
Or the northern part of the range.
And, for the most part, a lot of that data is really thinking about basic physiology.
Yeah.
As far as how it drives habitat selection or nest initiations, things that are really of direct influence or interest to a manager, I think that's where we need a little bit of a boost. We need more people thinking about that and researching in different places for different game birds too. I mean, I've spent a lot of time working on bobwhite scaled quail and a little bit with wild turkey and greater prairie chicken, but there's not much else out there. We know it affects all these species at some level, and there's just a lot of room to learn.
And I hate to give Calicut a duck segue here, but you and I were talking about, because we're talking about when we get Frank on, we were going to talk about foraging behavior in a typical Mississippi winter when it's 70 degrees. Yeah. And doesn't do mallards even need to, how much food do they even need to take in? Because when it's cold, obviously they're going to feed more because they have to. But it's often we're duck hunting in late January up until the last week. Hell, it could be 65 degrees and the sun's out all day. And what does that do to those birds? But we don't have a whole lot of data, to my knowledge, in the duck world. And I think you confirmed that even helps us understand how it being hot to us, hot during the winter affects, because duck hunters will complain these birds aren't moving. Well, maybe they're not, but why would they? And so I guess to say just the whole thermal question, either you said it in your first slide, or was it temperature as habitat or something? You had some phrase there. Was it temperature as habitat?
Yeah. Basically think of temperature as habitat are all the things that an organism needs to survive. So it's cover, food, water, space. So for a bobwhite, take that cover segment, its thermal cover is in there. So temperature is part of their habitat, and it is variable, just like all these things that we can see the structural variation. We can't see the temperature variation, but you can feel it. It also affects food availability. You remember I had that slide about the turkey space use and how they were constrained to these riparian corridors because of the tree cover. They're Rio Grande wild turkey in summer in western Oklahoma, buddy, they don't go very far from the tree.
Really?
They can't. It's too hot most of the day. What food resources do they have? Are the food resources even close enough that they can access them? Without overheating? Distribution of food, the distribution of cover types that makes all, we know interspersion is important.
Sure.
But this just kind of brings it home, it's a little more multifaceted of why they need this interspersion.
That got me, thinking about that as a component, of habitat, this thermal portion of it. And to Mark's question, why, for waterfowl. why, folks don't think birds move on warm days, what have you. But I think that'd be really cool with a lot of this, telemetry data that we're about to have to kind of see how that temperature influences, or at least ambient temperature may influence movements, and then kind of get at
because
see some disproportional, type of use that you can raise questions. Because I'm sure willow thicket obviously has a different, operative temperature for a duck.
Oh yeah,
and so when it gets cold, that's why they love, particularly mallards really like, a lot of the shrub type wetland cover. And so I have no idea what the difference in temperature is, or operative temperature is in those. But yeah, there's certainly,
but no one's looked.
Yeah, and Ryan Askren and I were talking a lot about how particularly shrub wetlands or that type of cover are probably underemphasized among wetland managers, and that that hopefully some of us tracking large numbers of birds under lots of different conditions can really kind of help us solidify a little bit more, how much they rely on that type of cover. And then we could dive deeper into that question from there, like what exactly, why is that?
Well, y'all got it harder because like the quail world, we can create shrub cover a little bit easier. It's hard for y'all to create a shrub wetland.
Yes.
It's either you got them or you can enhance them.
Enhancement of
the geomorphology has a lot to do with
so it's more of like retaining them on the landscape and enhancing the ones you have. So if you've got an overgrown, you get some drought or drier conditions and they go a little drier, and maybe that allows some more of those shrubs to come up and get thicker and stuff. So making, most managers just wait for that summer where you're going to be able to get a mulcher in there and go open that up a little bit. But, don't go crazy with it. Just open up a few holes in there. But that's mostly what we're doing, either retaining them on the landscape and enhancing them when we can.
And see, like with us, I've been fortunate to work with a handful of landowners that are willing to invest the money into planting shrubs. But John Grucci and I were talking about this the other day. We don't really know how to plant them. We know how to plant them to increase survival, but the spacings, the configuration, in Mississippi, we've all been going off Kevin Nelms's diagram and we plant them 5 by 5, 30 by, kind of thing. And it's fine. It makes a quail, it makes a little shrub thicket, but we don't really know what the size
Kevin knows.
Is. Kevin may know, Did you ever work with him, Kevin Nelms? Yeah. He's a character, man. He's not listening, so we can talk about it.
We need to get him on.
We should get Kevin Nelms on. That would be hilarious. But we don't know, should it be 30 by 30, 50 by 50, 100 by 100? And so one of the things we're going to do with this project we're starting at Charles Ray Nix is, because I told Grucci, I said, well, let's do this first. Let's go to he and I were talking about a way to get at that without doing some experimental plantings and then waiting for them to grow, because that's no fun. Let's do like this kind of passive inventory of, I'd say native, but existing shrub cover, and how so if you go to Black Prairie WMA, there are some enormous plum thickets on there. I mean, enormous, like as big as the footprint of this building, some of them, right? And then there's a lot of small ones. Now, we don't have any radio telemetry on that area yet to kind of figure out how quail are using them, but we could, just through GIS, we could go in and we could map out kind of the range of size and configuration, and we could do the same with dogwood thickets. Blackberry's a little bit different because it's rarely by itself. There's a lot of, but you could do it. You could we could kind of get what I suggest let's just do an inventory of what on areas that are managed for quail, what is kind of the range and distribution and diversity of size and configuration of the existing shrub cover, just to give us an idea on maybe what historically, but how many places do you have where we haven't manipulated the landscape enough to where there's anything historic? But I just don't have I've planted a lot of dogwood and Chickasaw plum thickets, and I've planted a lot of strips because unfortunately landowners love strips of Chickasaw plum. I'd rather not plant strips of Chickasaw plum, but some landowners like it. So we may not be doing any favors when we're doing that.
Yeah, and there's only been a couple studies that have tried to quantify like if shrub cover can it get too big, or what Fred Guthrie did a classic paper where, this was in Oklahoma, but basically there was a size at which point there was, quote, wasted space in the middle of the shrub thicket that,
I remember that.
If it was larger than this, that would probably be better to split it up and have more herbaceous cover in between them. But, that was context specific.
Yeah.
It probably is applicable to those shrubs in that landscape, but it may not be applicable here where the vegetation is very different and the environmental conditions are very different. A lot of our discussion up to this point is really thinking about adults.
Yeah.
That with maybe with broods that have the ability to move and make decisions on a minute's notice. I find really interesting is the nest location, or something that's very fixed. So once that bird makes a decision on where to drop those eggs, she's locked in. I mean, you sit with it or you abandon, but you can't move. They're not moving the eggs once they figure out, this isn't going to work. I don't have good screening cover. I don't have good thermal cover. And we've also shown that they're making very micro-site decisions on where to put those nests. And with turkey and prairie chickens and quail, we've seen that even subtle differences from me to you, like a meter, there's a temperature difference. And often these locations, I have no idea if the birds are even cognizant of this, or if they're cueing in on something that is related to temperature, is just correlated. But a lot of times these nest sites are not only cooler when it's hot, but they're warmer when it's cool. So they're choosing sites that are moderate or moderate temperatures, which I think is just fascinating.
It is fascinating.
What is the cue that they're looking for to make that decision?
Well, then, man, that brings up, so, a few years back, a lot of people in the turkey world were suggesting that turkeys weren't making, there was no selection in nest sites. It was somewhat random because they couldn't find a relationship between the factors they measured that influence selection, and those weren't the same factors that influence success. There was the lack of congruence between the two. And several people, myself included, argue that wasn't the correct interpretation maybe of that. It's not that they're random. And I can remember talking to a guy who had done a big telemetry study, and he, they were getting locations like every 15 minutes. And he pointed out that where they nested, they had never been before since they had marked them. Like they had not been to that spot before, and they were interpreting that as maybe there's not a whole lot of selection here, or maybe they're selecting within this kind of, what do you call it, evolutionary range that we can't detect, right? It's just this range of things we pick it up. And I wasn't thinking the thermal stuff at the time, but I remember we were sitting at an airport and I was talking to this guy, and he goes, "They've never been there before, so how are they selecting it?" And I said, "Well, if you move to a new area, how long does it take you to decide you want to live there? Like if you go for a job interview, you've never been there, it doesn't take you long to go, I might do it." So we don't know how they're processing information. We don't know what those cues are. And maybe if it is thermal, which I don't think anybody's looked at that except maybe y'all stuff on the terms of nest site selection with turkeys, if we're not finding that the things that influence selection are the things that influence success, maybe that's not what that's not the parameter they're looking at. Maybe it's thermal.
That maybe we're measuring the wrong thing.
We're measuring the wrong thing. Or maybe we're
at the wrong scale.
Well, the scale is my biggest issue. I feel like we're probably measuring those things at the wrong scale too, everybody, because we have no idea how a bird, if you think back to like Peter and Amy Grant's work, what was it, a millimeter of depth in a beak made the difference in a drought year to which species made it through that drought. Millimeter of difference for the caliper was what they showed. Like we don't know the scale at which birds are responding to things, but if it's thermal, right, and say that, or maybe thermal in a hierarchy is the most important thing, and then the vegetation stuff maybe is secondary. But if it's thermal, then that would explain a lot of why it's been pretty hard to find or pretty hard to document. Now, there's been some sense out of the UGA lab and the LSU lab that have showed some degree of selection, but maybe it was so hard to find it because it was a thermal question more than a structural question.
Potentially. Yeah. And I think the one thing I hope the listener doesn't take from this is that thermal trumps everything.
No, of course
not saying that. I think the point is that cover is a little more complicated than just visual screening cover. Factory.
Oh yeah, let's get into that.
Less studied. We know almost nothing about.
Where are we at on time, James?
We still got to.
Yeah, let's do the olfactories. Okay. We've been dancing around it.
Yeah.
So if you think about how air moves across the surface of the earth, from an ecological standpoint, very little data has been collected. Again, especially from an applied standpoint. There's a lot of information, from the aviation world. We know how objects shape airflow and how it directs and causes eddies, and we know how to get lift. I mean, that's really where you have to look to get some idea of how to even ask this question from a ground nesting bird standpoint. But if you take it at a very simple approach, we'll just use a device called an anemometer, which measures wind, speed, and direction, basically, and for XYZ coordinates and time. So it's 4-dimensional space-time. So pretty simple device. And you start putting that device on the landscape in like downwind of a nest versus a random point or in different cover types, you see pretty quickly there's a lot of variation there too. It's not just temperature that's variable, it's wind. And the simplest way to think about this is if you're in a grassland, you have what's called laminar airflow. So if it's kind of homogeneous grass, the air moves across the surface of that grass fairly uniform. And if you're talking about an animal that is hunting primarily by scent, like a canid or a cat, the probability that it detects that scent is basically a function of the directionality of the wind, the distance, and the diffusion at a given wind speed. So what that means is if you're a coyote and everything from a physiological standpoint is working, and you can detect prey, then if you get downwind of that scent and it has not, the scent molecules have not diffused to the point that your brain can't register prey, then it's detected, whatever that is. And in this case, I'm thinking mostly like nest, something that you're there, you're fixed to that point. So you throw a shrub in or something with a different architecture that breaks that surface laminar flow up. Now all of a sudden we have some randomness because you have turbulence. Well, instead of going laminar, straight line, flowing, think about like, I don't know if y'all like fly fish. I'm a fly fisherman. Think about behind a rock and you've got an edge. Okay, so that we can visualize that with the water, but that's happening with air currents too. And these eddies, you'll have rollers that come in and out, and a trout is maybe picking up food, but when your fly comes down on the surface, sometimes it rolls in where you want it, sometimes it rolls out. Y'all know what I'm talking about?
If I hit it at all, yeah.
So even the perfect cast doesn't always put the food item in front of that trout where you want it. There's some randomness that you can't really predict. Well, that's happening with scent molecules.
Interesting.
And so if you all of a sudden, whether you chose to do it or it was random chance alone that you put a nest behind a shrub or you're hiding behind a shrub, if a canid goes downwind of you, it may or may not detect you. Even if the wind is in the right direction, the velocity is good, the scent is not diffused, just random chance alone, scent's over you, and you pass through at the wrong time. And we see that when we quantify wind. And what's fascinating
as
to
if
me
the
is
other
like, if
subject
that's the
wasn't
case,
complex enough.
why doesn't everything choose to nest around shrubs? Because there are birds that avoid them. Like birds are truly grassland obligates.
Yeah.
So clearly that's not the only mechanism.
Well, there's different predator guilds too, I
that's
guess.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. But that's a whole nother area of research that we know almost nothing about from a game bird standpoint. But again, if vegetation's influencing that, you as a manager have influence. And what you choose to do or not do has consequences.
Sure.
From an olfactory standpoint, from a thermal standpoint, from a visual screening standpoint, food standpoint, all those.
So just let me see if I can simplify that at best. From what we currently know, a manager should create, and I may be oversimplifying it, as much air turbulence as possible to decrease the probability of an olfactory predator. Probability
for quail?
For quail. And nothing else matters.
Yeah. I mean, having interspersed, diverse architectural shrubs should confer multiple survival benefits to a quail.
So, because I used to be extension too, so I'm always trying to figure out how to take something complex, just like you guys are pros at, and simplify it as much as I can without compromising the whatever. So we tell landowners all the time, manage for diversity, structural diversity, plant diversity, interspersion with quail, right? Across forb, grass, shrub. It seems like this is another check in that box, right? Diversity of structure, interspersion of various vegetation types to essentially create just as you and I often say, a casserole of chaos on the landscape where you're shifting somewhat, hopefully, the advantage to the prey versus the predator.
Yeah, and I think folks that are listening that are bird hunters that have traveled, you've seen this.
Well, we need to switch this to
because
how does it affect hunters. Yeah.
I mean, I hunted a lot in the Great Plains where shrub cover was very limited. Some landscapes only 5 or 10%. So there's a lot of laminar airflow going on out there. And oftentimes, dogs are picking up and pointing coveys at close to 100 yards. It doesn't happen much in the
Maybe your dog might.
hunting woods. You don't have dogs locking up on coveys.
No.
And before I really started quantifying olfactory, I was always curious about that. Like,
interesting.
What is it?
You're right.
Well, then when you start visualizing the airflow, it's like, that's exactly what I'm seeing.
Yeah.
The scent cone is moving uninterrupted, so detection probability is very different. So you can actually have high detection probability at low quail densities when you're hunting Kansas, you might only have a bird per 2 or 3 acres and have a 15 covey day.
Yeah.
Whereas that density, it would be really hard to do
Yeah.
in South Georgia.
I'm sure
But
the
they're
wind
carrying higher bird density, so detections are
and it's probably a little more
Very
different too.
different.
Yeah. God, you're right though. Like you wouldn't have the ability to. So that makes me think. Well, I don't know if this was on the topic or not, but I know Tall Timbers. I know Guthrie did some of this back in the day. I think Tall Timbers is doing some of it. I know the Rolling Plains was doing some of it. We're looking at dogs detection rates, putting the GPS units on the dog. Because I know at Itchway, when they hunt the course that our research is on, Justin Rechtenwald's back there with telemetry, staying behind us, and seeing how we miss. And it seems like an easy number is at least half, but I'm sure it varies. And have y'all looked at that? I don't know who's leading that up.
Yeah,
but
there's
have y'all looked at the wind and as a covariate to explain any of that, or
not very well. Not how the weather might influence that, but there is variability because of weather. A lot of variability just in movement. If the birds are up, if for whatever reason the birds are actively feeding, there's a lot more scent available. There's a lot of ground scent that dogs might cross. So the detection likelihood looks very different. You can hunt through a course that there's 8-9 coveys and you have 1 covey detected. Sit down and take a break. Go right back through the course and find 5. It's like the same path you just went. It's like, well, with the same dog. Some of that is just that the birds were loafing and then they started feeding. They got on a big feed.
Because I can remember Steve Snell saying when he ran his dogs, I guess was on the Rolling Plains, he was telling me how many they missed. It was 60 or something. And I was like, don't feel bad. Like, apparently that's pretty standard. And that guy's dogs hunt, I would argue, probably more than just about any non-guide dogs on the planet. They're getting as much exposure as anybody. And then the few other people I've talked to, like at Itchway, I mean, those are fantastic dogs.
Best there are.
And they're still
It
made me feel better as a guy with my first bird dog. Okay, so it's not my dog missing coveys makes me feel better, but it ought to. What I love the most about that research is that a lot of people, we deal with them. You're at the university, you probably did too. We deal with a lot of people. The average student now is a lot more disconnected to hunting in general, the average wildlife student, than they were 20, 30 years ago. Yeah, and motivations have changed. Appetite for art's different. It's just different. So a lot of people are under the impression that the hunter has this tremendous advantage and that every time they go out, they're just killing things. And I'm like, well, come bird hunting with me and you'll find out it's not that simple. So when I find a piece of information to show, what, these birds really have the advantage here. They're really, they can outsmart our dogs. They can outsmart, they have the upper hand here, and that's just to find them. And there's much less get them under the gun.
And there's also a lot of handler error. Okay. What I mean by that is we pull our dogs off
too soon.
Far too soon. And you don't really appreciate that fully, I think, until you chase a lot of these birds with telemetry. Yeah. So you go out with a dog with telemetry at the same time, so real time how those birds are reacting to the dog and how the dog is trying to. And you start really paying attention to your dog, and you see that the dog knows there's a covey here. I would have pulled that dog away. I would have thought, what's he doing? He's dragging. We need to go. I think there's a covey up here, and I'm actually pulling that dog off. So following these birds with telemetry has made me be a much more patient dog handler. I am way more apt to watch that dog and pay attention to its behavior and body language and look for subtle cues and give it benefit of the doubt when it starts sniffing around, like instead of saying it's a rat.
Yeah.
Probably isn't. And what you really see, like you were talking about, the dogs miss the birds half the time. They actually don't miss the birds very often. The hunter misses the birds. So a lot of times we're pushing the dog, or the birds have evaded the dog at no fault of the dog. We say gentleman bobwhite. They're not. They're running.
Jerks.
And they run over the hill, they flush. That happens a lot.
And that probably has a lot to do with how much they've been hunted as well.
Yeah, and how much human pressure they get. We see that behavior a lot on Tall Timbers property, and we don't hunt hard, but they get a lot of human pressure because we're tracking them all the time. Yeah. So they know what we are about.
They're running.
They don't want to be around us. Yeah. So there's a lot of bird evasive behavior that you never see, and the dogs lose the scent. Also, there's that random olfactory component. How many times have you walked up on a dog and it's intense, and then it loses its intensity?
Happens a lot.
And then it's intense again, and then it loses. And sometimes they'll just leave it because they can't sort it out. Well, what is happening sometimes, is the scent cone is weak and it's going in and out of its space. And so the dog by random chance alone, because of the wind, the vagaries of the wind direction and turbulence, it loses the scent and it moves. Sometimes it moves wrong and it bumps the birds.
Yeah.
So just give your dog a little more grace.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the behaviors. Was it Dan McGrath's research with James Martin? Was that in South Carolina or was that at Tall Timbers? I thought it was in Plantation in South Carolina or North Carolina. I can't remember. Maybe it was Horton or something. But anyway, they really, I mean, I think they were getting locations regularly throughout the hunt and showed just the diversity of behaviors these birds were doing. It had a lot to do, if I recall, with how much they had been messed with. Yeah. So like a lot less likely to get up off the ground once they had been toyed with a fair amount, which of course makes sense. And I'm sure there's the impact of natural predators and hawk migration probably influencing that too during a certain part of the hunting season where you've got a flux of predators coming in.
And also something that Bill Palmer taught me early on when I moved to Tall Timbers is if their crop is full or not, if they've been on the feed.
Yeah.
So if they're full,
They're like, they don't want
versus when they're first coming on the feed.
I don't want to jump and fly after I've just had a meal either.
That could change their
I didn't think about
First
that.
time he told me that, I was like, I don't know about that. And then I start paying attention, like, oh, he's right. He's absolutely right. That is absolutely happening. So you'll have periods where everything is just flushing wild. You can't get near them. And then it's like 30 minutes later, they've all settled down.
Well, it makes sense. I mean, a full crop can weigh what? It's of just
Well, don't you get lethargic?
Well, that's what I'm
after you
saying.
eat?
Like,
it's like, I don't really want to move right now.
So, I mean, but as a percentage of their body mass.
It does seem to happen.
Yeah. Well, and you know, as a percentage of their body, I mean, we've all, I've seen them at Tall Timbers, you know, that when they're full, it's bursting out. That's got to weigh, you know, as a percentage of their body weight, that's probably not nothing.
Well, and it's not just the weight. It's what's happening.
Sure. They're
internal.
The energy expense to process it.
Yeah, I mean, you're burning a lot of calories. It's a natural process for an animal to get lethargic.
Yeah.
When it's energy demanding to start breaking that food resource down.
I wonder how much different that is with waterfowl, though, just because their evasive strategies are so different. Like they have to fly, essentially. Well, I guess they don't have to.
They don't have to. No. I mean,
Like that willow
in the
thicket.
cover, they go in that willow thicket,
But if there's not enough shrub
Shrub
cover,
cover, then they go someplace else.
they have to make a suboptimal decision as well. Jeez. Well, that makes me feel better. So the take home that for listeners is give your dog a break, slow down, which every dog training book tells you, like just slow down.
Just slow
like
down.
that just walk slower. My dog, I think I was telling you at lunch the other day when I was doing my NAVTA test, his natural ability test, they were like, come on. And I'm like, this is kind of how we walk. Like we move pretty slow. And they're like, move your dog along. And I was like, I would never walk this fast through a field in my life. But, you know, they were trying to run a test. But that does make me feel better. You know, when my dog's not finding many birds, like, well, there's probably half out there. At least I can tell myself that.
Is there anything else we need to hit on before we wrap this up?
Well, we could probably do this all day, but I guess we're probably getting close.
Yeah, we're about that point to wrap up.
Anything else you want to tell us about Tall Timbers work? Anything?
Well,
I've got a new website. It's been updated. It's very cool.
I think most listeners probably think of the organizations focused in the Red Hills, and obviously that's always going to be core to who we are. Fire ecology and game bird ecology, that's where Tall Timbers got its start, and that's a important region for bobwhites. And I think it's good to be able to have this region where we can have high bird numbers. We can ask a lot of questions there that are hard to ask in other places. That being said, it's very important to have sustained populations of quail throughout their distribution. So our organization is increasingly working in other areas to try to get wild birds back on the landscape. Including, you know, most recently, we've got a translocation project in Pennsylvania. They're extirpated from Pennsylvania. So we're just tickled to be working with Pennsylvania Game Commission and the Department of Defense to restore quail. And then we're now working on the Ames Plantation, one of the granddaddy of them all, National Field Trial. And you know, that's a historic property that had wild birds up until 25 years ago.
Yep.
In fact, folks here at Mississippi State worked with Tall Timbers on that research project. Wes Berger, Christine. And, you know, now it's, you know, been pen-reared, released birds, and we are in the process of restoring the habitat for bobwhite on that property. And hopefully that field trials will be able to be run in the very near future on wild birds again. And it's not just about the field trial while we're doing that. If, you know, that's a property that is so iconic, I think it'll give a lot of people in the Mid-South hope for quail restoration. And I think that's really important. Is it's not good enough just to say, well, we've got birds in western Oklahoma.
That's right.
We've got wild birds in North Florida, South Georgia. We need birds in Mississippi and Tennessee and Pennsylvania.
It's important.
Ohio.
It's important for the culture. You know, I I did Primos's. They did a series on bobwhite, year or two ago, and that was one of the things we talked about was just the importance of the culture. And he asked me, so what would you want to see in the next 10, 20 years? And I said, I want to see bird dog boxes in the back of more trucks, because I want people to realize it's worth putting a dog on the ground. And when we had John Mark on, one of the first ones we did, John Mark and I both agreed, if all the site visits I've done in Mississippi, there is not a spot, very few spots, but most of the state has a low residual quail population somewhere around. So when you actually do work and you have enough acreage being impacted, it's rare that we don't get quail to show up, and it's rare that we don't see quail increase. The challenge is getting enough landowners to do it. Just about on the WMAs, we've got bird populations. On the national forest, we've got bird populations. On the refuges that are managed, when people are burning, thinning, and manipulating soil, they have. John Mark and I did a site visit in Rankin County, and the guy thinned some trees, lit some fires, and then his neighbor had some tornado damage, did her clear cut. Bam, 4 coveys showed up.
Yeah.
Rankin County.
And that's the thing. I've done a lot of site visits like that where they recently did a clear cut. They did some kind of disturbance, and then boom, there was some quail singing out there. They saw a quail, bumped a covey, and they're like, "Man, I don't know where those came from. I hadn't seen a quail in however many years
Thank
or whatever."
goodness they're as resilient as they
Yeah,
are.
exactly.
That's what they said, why are you so obsessed with this bird? There's hardly any. I was like, the fact that everything we've done to the landscape to go against them, and the fact that there are still quail in the Deep South is shocking, right?
And selfishly, as bird hunters, we're thinking about the bobwhite, but it also is benefiting a whole suite of species.
Absolutely.
And that should give us also great satisfaction to be able to restore these cover types that will benefit other species that maybe we don't even know as much about that are also in decline. For example, that Pennsylvania site, when I was standing there about a year ago, listening to the first bobwhite whistling in the state of Pennsylvania in 20-something years, what I'm also hearing are dick sissels, indigo buntings, field sparrows, grasshopper sparrows, and eastern meadow. Those are all species of high conservation concern.
Absolutely.
And they're very hard. They're almost as hard to find in Pennsylvania as a bobwhite.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
So it's a whole suite of birds and other species that, are really suffering. And if bobwhite is the flagship that can get people excited about managing that type of vegetation, then I'm all for it.
Yeah, man. I think the phrase, they recorded John Mark and I's parts separately, and we ended up both saying the same phrase, which probably because we work together a lot, but we didn't know it till we heard it. But we both said I remain cautiously optimistic, and I said it, and then John Mark said it in his, so they ended up naming that segment "Cautiously Optimistic." And John Mark and I laugh about it now because we didn't plan that. But even in Mississippi, when I came here, there's not just quail everywhere. But I knew the landscape had enough quail that it was possible. And with landowners that are trying or getting it. I mean, are we gonna get a bird per acre on a lot of these sites? Probably not, because we're not usually have a big enough property and the landscape's pretty hostile. We're not getting a lot of immigration coming in from that. But we've got properties that are pretty happy, and I've had clients in multiple states where I got a client in West Tennessee, and just a little bit of extra effort, and text me the other day. He goes, out on the farm now, I got quail singing everywhere. I think it's a 900-acre property, and there's a lot of those scattered around the Deep South.
Yeah.
And smaller. Look at the Longview property, 550 acres, only 300 of it is what I would consider quail habitat. I've radioed 6 of the coveys out there. I know there's 6 coveys. I don't know how many I've missed. I mean, that's 300 acres of quail habitat, and we've got birds on it. So it's doable. And all this kind of research we're talking about is only going to make us refine that management better, keep the research questions going, and maybe give our dogs a little grace.
I'm telling you, I'm optimistic. I mean, honestly, there's more interest in the South for bobwhite now than I ever thought I would see in my career.
I agree.
Yeah.
I mean, 20 years ago, I would have never dreamed this many people would be calling, asking, wanting to change management, making decisions on their property for bobwhite. I think those days were long gone, and it just seems to be accelerating. And we need those quail advocates. We need them change management on their land. We also need them advocating the public land management agencies, because there are vast public acres that could be managed.
100%. And just as a testament, so you take me, you, and John Mark, 30, John Mark's what, 33, 30 to 40. We all got bird dogs in the last 5 years as residents of the state of Mississippi, right? That ought to tell you that there's...
You got a little hope, or you wouldn't get...
I wouldn't have bought a bird dog if I didn't think I had enough time, energy, and locations for him to find birds. Now, granted, I travel to and hunt. I also hunt
a lot of
here.
woodcock too.
Hunt a lot of woodcock too, but we also hunt quail here.
Yeah.
And we are upland bird hunters in our 30s in the deep South. And we're anomalies for a lot of reasons. I don't know how often, how much more that's happening. But I do know there are people that are willing to get a bird dog in the deep South now that wouldn't have even thought about it 10 years ago. Yeah. And that is a slight indication of some progress we're making.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Dwayne, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we can have you back again soon. Maybe you won't have to drive all the way to Starkville to be on it. We can just do it remotely. But I really enjoyed your seminar the other day, and it's got me thinking a lot more about thermal cover. My head's spin about this mallard research we're doing too, see how we can plug some of that in. But
Ducks. He just had to end on ducks.
I did because, I did it not because I'm such a duck nerd, but because I know it irritates you. Dwayne, thank you so much. Appreciate you coming.
Enjoyed it.
Yes, sir.
Thanks for joining us on Gamebird University Podcast. To keep up to date on when new episodes are dropped or for more information on game birds and their management, you can follow us on Instagram at MSUEXT_Gamebird or follow us on Facebook at MSU Extension Gamebird Program.